because I don't think I want to be on the stage. Okay, recording in progress. Thanks, Chandler. Yeah. Anyway, let's dive right into it. Oh yeah. So Chandler said that feel free to like shout out questions or maybe raise a hand if you got like a burning question, but be aware that I will answer your question. So if you ask a question, make sure you want to hear the answer, because I don't know if you talk to a lot of historians, but you might be here for a while um, if you really want the answer. Yeah. So like Chandler's introduction said, I'm going to talk about where we are. What situation are we in right now with Great Salt Lake? I'm going to zoom out a little bit and talk about water throughout the region. And the bulk of the presentation is going to be about how we got here. And then we're going to talk about like what we can do. So, I mean, step one is showing up. So you being here tonight is doing something. May feel like a small thing, but we really do need community involvement if we're going to tackle this issue, because as you're going to see, it's a deep, complex problem that is multifaceted. So thanks again for showing up. Yeah. Next slide, please. Okay, so if you're here, you're probably aware of some of the challenges that face Great Salt Lake. A lot of people are very aware of the problem of toxic dust. So as the lake recedes from a lack of freshwater inflow, more of the lake bed is exposed, and the wind kicks up the dust, and that gets into our air and pollutes the air. But this slide is, these are called microbialites. So I want to draw special attention to this because this is something that's very time sensitive. The dust, the heavy metals, and the toxins that are in the lake bed and the dust, that's happening, and that's going to get worse as the lake the lake level continues to drop. But this is a special cause for concern here. These are reef-like structures. These look like rocks. They're actually colonies of microbes. And this forms the basis of the food web for Great Salt Lake. So these microbes feed the brine shrimp and the brine flies that are the primary food source for something like 10 million migratory birds. So as more of these, so these are supposed to be underwater, and they kind of thrive in the shallows of Great Salt Lake. As they're exposed to the elements, they eventually will die. And then the brine shrimp and brine flies don't have food, and we're facing potentially a food web collapse. Something else that's happening for the brine shrimp in particular, the lake is getting saltier as it dries up because water evaporates, salt stays behind, and at a certain point, brine shrimp can't live in the level of salinity that we're approaching. And so again, there's a whole food web that depends on these tiny little creatures. And so this is something that is something that's time sensitive. This is not really something that we want to continue to put off. So the issue is, the reason we got into this situation is because of human diversions. So global climate change is making the situation worse. We are trending hotter and drier in the U.S. West. Experts call this a mega drought or aridification, but this is not just a normal drought. This is long-term hotter and drier conditions. But aside from that, I mean, that's making it worse. But the problem is something that is ultimately, it's human caused, which means it's in our control to do something about and fix. So this is an irrigation canal that diverts water from one of the freshwater sources that flow into Great Salt Lake. And it's estimated that human diversions have lowered the lake's level by 11 feet. And we really cannot stand any additional diversion So as Chandler mentioned, we are opposed to Bear River Development Project because that would lower the lake's level by another like foot just by itself. Okay, thanks. Okay, so yeah, like I mentioned, I'm actually going to zoom out from the Great Salt Lake Basin. So Great Salt Lake's up there as part of the Great Basin watershed. Utah's kind of split in half. You can kind of see, it's kind of difficult. I like this map, but this line here between the two major watersheds isn't totally distinct. But Utah's split in half between the Great Basin watershed and the Colorado River watershed. So just as I kind of get into like a regional perspective, I just wanted to make sure that, right, what happens in the Colorado Rivershed doesn't directly impact Great Salt Lake, but the region has the same laws, it has the same history, it has the same culture, the same politics. And so what we're facing in Great Salt Lake is the same thing that we're facing in the Colorado River. Not going to fully get into that, but if you've seen any news about the Colorado River system right now, it's also in jeopardy because we are using too much water. It's a simple problem, right? We're using more water than we have. If you, it's like if you have a checking account and your balance is getting smaller, there's only one way that that happens. You're spending more than what you're bringing in, and that's exactly the problem that we're seeing in the Great Salt Lake Basin and throughout the West. But for such a simple problem, it's very difficult. There's a lot of layers, there's a lot of different angles to how we got here and also to how we can attempt to solve the problem. And so this presentation is all about, how, this is just one piece, right? So I'm a historian. I bring, in a particular approach to this complex problem. This is not going to be the definitive solution, but this is going to be my attempt to try to break this apart and try to give people an understanding of how we can do something about this, right? And so when you look at the history, the system that we have is paradoxical, right? Nobody got here and was surprised that there's not a lot of water. Nobody woke, like if you woke up today and you thought like, hey, I'm in a desert, like hasn't happened to anybody, right? There's no surprises to the place we live in. But paradoxically, we have made water very easy to consume. We've encouraged water consumption precisely because there is not a lot of water. And the reason why that is it can really be boiled down to the simple fact that if there's going to be permanent settlement in such a dry place, you have to facilitate agriculture somehow. And if you're going to have agriculture, you got to have irrigation. And so the way to have a substantial population in the West is to create a system where irrigation is cheap and easy. So yeah, how did I get here? Thanks for that courtesy laugh. Next. Thanks, Krista. Krista Perry. Okay, so I'm gonna focus on the 1890s. I'm gonna take us back to the 1890s. I'm gonna focus on this decade because this was a pivotal decade where really the country is gonna try to figure out what America is, what is the future of the country. But first of all, okay, so here's what's going on in the 1890s. This is why we care. So in 1890, the frontier closed. The U.S. Census Bureau said there's no more line between frontier and settlement. And what ended up happening was the country substituted a free land policy for a free water policy. And I'm going to break that down a little bit more, but this is why we care. This is why I'm drawing attention to this. In many ways, federal reclamation was the last stage of Manifest Destiny. Settlers clamored for free water and free land in 1800 and free water a century later. That's from historian Donald Pisani, basically cribbing this presentation from his book here. And just to kind of corroborate this viewpoint is another perspective. This is Lakota scholar Nick Estes. Access to indigenous water is crucial for securing the ownership of indigenous lands and generating wealth from these lands over generations. Water is settler colonialism's lifeblood. So if we're going to keep the frontier open, if we're going to keep people moving west, you got to figure out the water situation. So closer? Okay. Yeah, sorry about that. So yeah, just to like rewind a little bit from the 1890s. So this is a very famous painting, and this represents manifest destiny, right? So this giant woman is civilization, and she is headed west because that's the destiny of Euro-American civilization. Well, by the time so in 1862, the federal government instituted a free land policy with the Homestead Act. By the 1870s, by the time this is painted in 1872, settlers had started to run into a problem. And that problem, you can see right here, it's the 100th meridian. So this is the label is eastern boundary of the arid region. So once you get past that point, there's not enough rainfall for you to grow crops, right? So this map, this is a map that John Wesley Powell prepared. He's a famous explorer. He led a series of expeditions down the Colorado River beginning 1869, became the director of the U.S. Geological Survey, and prepared this whole report and prepared this map. So this becomes important because the Congress is saying, hey, John Wesley Powell, how are we going to settle these arid western lands? What are we going to do here? And Powell had an answer. And he goes, so he's in D.C., and he's telling Congress, what you have to do, for one, is you got to have, this has got to be based on a community. This is not the individual free-for-all where settlers can just go and figure out their own irrigation. Too much work for an individual family. You got to have a community, and you got to have some kind of authority in place who's going to call the shots and say, we're using water for this. If we have extra water, we can use it for this. And so he proposed, because water is so important to any kind of civilization or any kind of society you're going to have out here, he proposed drawing the political boundaries according to the watersheds. So that's kind of where you can see like all the different colors. These are different watersheds. And he said your politics has got to follow the hydrology of this region because it's too important to ignore. Yeah, go ahead, next. So in 1893, Powell goes to a irrigation congress in Los Angeles, and he talks to farmers and developers, and he tells them this. You're piling up a heritage of conflict and litigation over water rights. There's not enough water to supply the land. And they all shout him down, right? He got the same reception, by the way, in Congress when he tried to tell people what the deal was. Nobody wanted to listen to him. And that's a meme. That's about how it went, right? Nobody wants to listen to Powell for a couple of reasons. For one is Congress liked the individualistic free-for-all, for one. And also what Powell was telling them was the amount of water that you have now, that's what you got to plan on the future. There's not going to be some extra water that's going to show up out of nowhere. And people didn't want to hear that. So this is difficult for policymakers to hear, Partly because, so this is a historian, Frederick Jackson Turner, and he kind of articulates this, this idea, the importance of this frontier and westward expansion to the American experiment of democracy, right? Free land and the advance of American settlement westward explain American development. He makes a case that we need a frontier to maintain this exceptional American culture of democracy. And so he's saying we can't give up on the frontier. Everybody in Congress is saying we can't give up on the frontier. And there's also another powerful interest group that does not want to give up on this idea, and these are the boosters. So there's this phenomenon called boosterism. These are people who have a financial interest in getting more people to move to the West. And again, the way you do that is you got to have some kind of agriculture. So this is just an ad, but it kind of represents this very like romanticized homestead in the far West. This is what you could have if you go buy your quarter section of land, you go buy a train ticket, and you move west. Railroads are pushing this really hard because railroads have spent a lot of money laying track that goes out west, and they're going to make more money if there's city centers where they can haul people and haul consumer goods. This is another example of the kind of like, it's very propagandistic. There's a lot of ads. There's a lot, like the boosters are really selling the idea of moving to the interior West. I mean, this is California, which is like, they were really laying it on thick for California, but it's similar situation in the interior West. I saw somebody online compare boosterism to the promotion for the Fire Festival. And that's kind of how you want to think about this, is like you get so excited and you buy your train ticket and then you're in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and it's like, oh, there's nothing here, I'm going to die. So this is, so despite like all the ads and everything with California, this is what is now downtown Los Angeles in 1906. So it was a cow town. It's a desert city. Its whole existence depends on pulling water in from somewhere where it does not naturally flow to Los Angeles. And the way that this kind of got, so let's kind of recap where we're at, right? So everybody's, there's these different interest groups that are very ideologically and financially invested in keeping the frontier going, right? But John Wesley Powell is raining on everybody's parade and saying, hey, guys, there's no water out there. Oh, another thing that Powell says. So as of 1878, when he prepared his report, he told them all of the best places are almost all taken already, right? The places where you're going to easily irrigate, the best places to claim, they're already taken. Anyway, so people are still trying to figure it out. They're not willing to give up on the dream. So enter William Ellsworth Smythe. This guy is he's a propagandist for irrigation. Essentially, he calls himself an evangelist for irrigation, and he really there's a lot of kind of quasi-religious myth that goes into his sales pitch for how feasible it is to irrigate the West. He starts this magazine called Irrigation Age, and I know it's small, but the cover of this magazine, you've got like the kind of like neoclassical theme going on, and that's because he's really like leaning really hard on this idea of civilization, because he really doesn't have the facts to back up what he's trying to sell, basically. He says irrigation was the cause that bore the white flower of civilization. White flower of civilization is not really incidental. He means a particular type of civilization. And what ends up happening, oh, sorry. I need to, actually go back to that last slide. So Smythe links up with a congressperson in Nevada named Newlands. Sorry, I mix that up. The next guy is Newell, but Newlands is the guy in Nevada, and he links up with William Ellsworth Smythe. The reason being is because he understands that he's got to figure something out if his state is going to have a future. Nevada at the time was completely dependent, basically, on silver mining. And the rest of the West, largely, also depended on mining in one form or another. But the problem with mining is it's boom and bust. You can't really build a permanent society around mining because the price of silver drops, and then you fire everybody, and you pack up your operation, and you leave behind a ghost town. And so that you got ghost towns throughout the West as the result of busted mining operations. Or the mine plays out, and you got no more reason to be there. So Newlands is motivated to connect with Smythe. He helps him publish a book later on. And Newlands kind of takes these ideas, which are bunk, right? Like Smythe is just making stuff up, essentially. So Newlands kind of takes these ideas, kind of, fleshes out his sales pitch to Congress with this stuff, and he ends up sponsoring the Reclamation Act of 1902, also known as the Newlands Act, named for him. And this is going to create the Reclamation Service, which is the federal government's agency for irrigation, tasked with desert reclamation. Yeah. And then Frederick Newell, this is a guy who later becomes the director of reclamation. And this is the mentality that wins out, right? So with all the propaganda, with all the ideology, this kind of encapsulates the hopes. The dead and profitless deserts need only the magic touch of water to make arable lands that will afford farms and homes for the surplus people of our overcrowded eastern cities. So all we got to do, we just got to pump some water into the desert. Everything's going to work out. It's going to create all these wonderful farms and homes. And all the people in the east can flee the awful, terrible cities, which separate discussion there. They can flee and go to the frontier. They can go to the west. What was I going to say? Anyway, next slide. Maybe this will remind me. So this is the mean center of population, and I just kind of just to kind of underscore the point here. You can see where 19th century, this free land, quote, by the way, when I say free land and free water, just that's heavily scare quoted. None of that was free by any means. But 19th century, this free land policy, people are just cruising across the West. 1890, frontier closes, and then it's still advancing a little bit. And then by the 40s, 50s, the Bureau of Reclamation is going to get a real big boost from the post-war federal government spending. It's going to be dishing out big-time water infrastructure projects and allowing for the 20th century population boom in the West. It's all, there's lots of factors that go into this, but this is all made possible through water projects, by taking water from one source and piping it, funneling it in one way or another to where you want people to be. So we get some water here. Okay, so you just want to kind of make one more point while we're talking about the West as a region. So this is the Colorado River Basin. So by 1922, people are going to start, people in these 7 western states, excuse me, they're going to start to want to lay claim on what they feel like is their water. So the states get together and they hash out the Colorado River Compact in 1922. And here you can see the upper basin and the lower basin, which is how they kind of divide it up. And by 1944, they have to revisit it because Arizona and California have been fighting about it for a couple of decades. They also did not invite Mexico to the negotiations in 22. And so they're like, okay, fine, like, we'll listen to you now, Mexico. And in 1944, when they revisit it, all of the Native American nations in the basin continue to go ignored for the time being until present. But the way they divide up this water in 1944, they dish out 7.5 million acre feet to the upper basin, 7.5 million acre feet to the lower basin, and sure, why not? Let's tack on 1.5 million acre feet for Mexico. If there's a surplus, the lower basin gets another million acre feet. So we got a total then of, what is that? I forget what it is. I think it's 17.5 million acre feet allocated in the Colorado River Basin. Does anybody want to take a stab at what the problem might be with that figure? Yes. That number does not exist. That is correct. That is correct. So when they were coming up with the Colorado River Compact, they were basing it off of a few especially wet years. They didn't bother 40 years later to double check their figures. They just figured, hey, we've got 18 million acre feet of Colorado River water to play with. Why not just assign it out? But the problem is the mean natural flow of the Colorado River system is 13.5 to 14.5 million acre feet. So from the jump, from the very beginning, the Colorado River Compact was overallocated. This is not based on reality, right? This is based on the ideology. This is based on, so in the 19th century, as people are starting to move west, there was the slogan that rain follows the plow. And this was the idea that people thought that you cultivate the prairie, you plow it up, and you're going to actually change the climate. You're going to change the landscape into something that's more fertile and wet than what you started with. They figured out that idea did not last all that long, but that ideology, that hope and that wish that it's the destiny for Euro-American civilization to settle the entire West over the whole continent led to this kind of magical thinking where we got all the water we need. It's all going to just work out. If we run out of water, we'll get it from somewhere else. They didn't immediately run into problems because so in 44 this was they just had water rights divvied up, right? This is what they call paper water. So until you can actually start diverting it, storing it in reservoirs and using that water, it's just water rights, right? But they so when they drafted the Colorado River Compact 100 years ago, they set up some poor sucker to come along and try to work off that document and run into big problems. And I got bad news. We're the suckers. This thing that's governed our river consumption, our river water for 100 years, it was never going to last. It just couldn't ever last. And now we've got to scramble and try to come up with something new. So you can thank those gentlemen for that. And so this is a recent Pat Bagley cartoon from a day or two ago. But yeah, this kind of captures it, right? The Colorado River Basin was overallocated from day one. They looked at a river, and they said, "Oh yeah, that's full. This is full enough." right. If this seems far-fetched, like this quote kind of captures it, right? So this was an executive in California's State Water Project. And he says, the moment we began settling in California, we overran our water supply. We've never gotten to the point where you could just stop, and we never will. Like, I don't think he's saying this as, I don't think he's saying this in a way that's like, I hope this is what happens. I think he's just describing like the trajectory that our history has placed us on, right? Like, we just can't stop. The only way is through. We're going to run into a crisis. We're going to like drive ourselves off a cliff eventually because we can't stop and say like, hey, what we're doing is just not going to work down the road. So now what, right? So we're the suckers. We got to deal with the fallout from like all this bad water policy. So now what, right? So this is a quote from Dan McCool. He's a political scientist at the U. I always forget. I can't remember if he like still teaches or if he's emeritus. I don't know. Anyway, he's a friend. He's a friend of the org. But it is time for a new era in water management. The first step requires dispensing with the absurd notion that infinite growth can take place in a region with severely constrained resources. This is as wild as it may sound, this is a big first step for a lot of people. This idea that we can just continue to grow, and there's always going to be more water from somewhere, and we can just go where we want to and tailor nature to our whims, to our convenience. This is letting go of that idea. It's like so deeply embedded in our history and our culture. It's a big first step for a lot of people. So, like, let's take that first step together and start to imagine what it looks like if our water is not going to end up where we want it to be. And so, like Chandler said, yeah. So we're an organization. We really depend on community support, and all the things that we want to do are going to depend on people getting together in rooms and talking about it and trying to figure something out. But yeah, we've got some exciting things coming up that we've got in the works, or that we've got planned. Come talk to us if you need to get on our email list, or if you have any questions about the things that we've got coming down the pipe. But basically, I mean, this is how it starts, right? We've got an issue that we can't really negotiate with anymore, and that is water. Water's not really moving. We've done all the water moving that we're going to do, and so now it comes down to figuring it out with other human beings and other human systems. And that's the hand that we've been dealt. It's not going to be smooth sailing, but it's doable. This is within our grasp. Like I said, the problems facing Great Salt Lake are human diversions. This is something that humans caused. This is something that we can work our way out of. Anyway, so thanks very much for coming. Thank you for listening to history from over 100 years ago. Really appreciate you, and yeah, have a good night, everybody.
Never been asked that before. I know that it's been gathering chemicals for hundreds of years, and we have naturally high arsenic in our soils. So I think it would probably be expensive, but it's a good question. I'll find out. Do you know? Kevin Perry, yeah. Get the, yeah, yeah. Good question. Sorry, we don't have that answer. Yeah.
I can try. Hi,
This is Alex. He's on our governing committee, and he's also with Heal Utah.
Alex Mayu, Heal Utah Policy Associate. I work on our clean air and clean energy campaigns, and yeah, I'm on the governing committee with these guys. That's a fantastic question, and that's something that we're trying to wrap our heads around now because they did make some decent first steps towards that. Last legislative session, you may have seen it was a combination of bills HB 33 and HB 157, which worked together to enable the Department of Fires, Forestry, and State Land to lease those water rights in 10-year leases. So the infrastructure for it set up, and theoretically, we got all this crazy money from the ARPA funds, which came from like the post-COVID stuff, and that money theoretically can go that way, but here at Save Our Great Salt Lake, we want to see them go further, and we want to see these purchases actually funded in like an actual way that will make that happen. It's kind of just like a very, very first step of that process. Unfortunately, it's a slow moving process, and right now, something that I'm sure some of you are going to ask are like, what are our policy initiatives and what are our policy goals? Right now, we're meeting together with a group of about 10 environmental nonprofits, maybe on a regular basis, and we're coming up with that currently. I'd love to kind of tell you what we've got right now, and I know that I really want to improve upon that program, but it's something that we have in the works, and maybe we'll do another event sometime soon to talk about policy. I haven't.
The thing about the water rights right now with farmers is they're only talking about temporary leases, which is not even close to, it's not going to do anything. And I think it's a very slow moving process. Those conversations are just getting started. I do think the solution has to include agriculture, given that that's where 80% of our water is going. So having those conversations with farmers, like what would it take for you to use less water or switch what you're growing, or figuring out if they want to sell their water rights and just fallow their land. I think that's the direction we need to go, but there has not been any serious movement there yet. Yeah. So use it or lose it is what she's talking about. So the farmers who have the senior water rights, if they don't use all of their water, then they get less water next year. So they have no incentive to save water. So that whole use it or lose it needs to change. I think it's so baked into the history of the West that it's going to be difficult, but that's kind of where our heads are at, is these larger kind of more paradigm shifting solutions, because we're going to run into this every year if we don't have something that totally kind of changes how we relate and use water. Totally. Yeah, I think yes, the feds should get involved. The challenge in Utah is finding a solution that the Utah state legislators will accept, that the feds are pushing, because they historically don't love each other, or at least the state doesn't like the feds. On the agriculture piece, yes, So 60% of all of the agricultural water use is alfalfa. A quarter of that is shipped overseas. And so I've been kind of attending these agricultural water optimization meetings to see like, okay, are they aware that, they need to switch what they're growing? And they're saying exactly what you're talking about. Like, oh, the only thing we need to do is just tell people that we're feeding them, we're feeding Utahns. And I'm like, are you? Like, how much of this is food for humans and how much of this is staying in Utah? So I think that sort of messaging, that direction is where we're looking to go as well.
A decent counterpoint to like alfalfa feeds people argument too is that brine shrimp ends up feeding people as well. That if you're really going to think of it as like a food chain type scenario, I mean, we need the brine shrimp in the lake to be feeding people as well, and that's an entire industry that needs to be considered if you're going to be using that argument as far as alfalfa feeding people.
In the back.
That is a fantastic question that I do not have an empirical figure for. I know. Yeah, come on, we'll square up, bro. Let's go.
Something I do. Yeah. Totally. So that is something I'm looking at, trying to figure out, like, okay, where are the alfalfa farmers? Who's doing what? But I think it's really important that we do not demonize the alfalfa farmers and do not villainize these individuals because they're working within a system, a very old system. This is their livelihood. And so I think we need to work with them. Any solution that we offer needs to support them as well. So I think it's a matter of kind of talking to these farmers and saying, what would it take? How could we support you to change? Because really at the root of it, like, yes, alfalfa is the problem, but the deeper problem is our agriculture in the United States. That's a whole nother deal, but yeah.
So I worked in the ski industry for 17 years. I worked for Powder Corp, owns a bunch of companies, and also Park City, and I sat on the executive committee at Ski Utah for a long time. And I think that we see this not just in the ski industry or travel industry, but I think we see this, it just is what's happening to all the systems that are in place, right? The structures that have been in place are there to support the structures that have been in place. And so they're kind of all patting each other's back in the sense of like, tourism is a big driver, as we know, right, to the state of Utah, as is the brine shrimp industry, as is all these other things. I think what we've seen over the last year, I will say, since the organization started, is it kind of was like they wanted to turn their back to us a little bit. But I think that now with a lot of the further publicity that we've gotten, namely, I think that the Daily and the New York Times piece that just came out in August, that really helped to shift tides. I think it's because they're really starting to see the impacts that this could have on the snow. I came from Colorado, right? And I remember when I started working in the ski industry a long time ago, 2002, we had just had the Olympics here, and it was like, oh, you know, Utah has the greatest snow on earth, but actually Colorado, kind of like, if you thought about it, they had the greatest snow. But what made the greatest snow on earth was really the Great Salt Lake. And so they really have used, I mean, that's a tagline on all of our license plates, right? Is the greatest snow on earth. And what happens when we don't have that greatest snow on earth? It's going to cause, you know, not only a loss of economy, but also the reason why so many of us live, work, and play here, right? Is like, this is what we love. This is where we want to be. And so I think that we're starting to have those conversations, which is great, because I think that people are realizing like, okay, we all need to work together. And that's really the key, right? I think that's why we started this coalition, really. It's like a coalition of all of us are just like volunteers. We're just like, we have to do something. And that's why you're all here, right? How many of you guys are all here because you know that we need to do something? This is how we get things done in the state, right? Sometimes we may not have the legislative support, but it's going to get there. And all of us coming together and talking about, we may not have the answers, right? We don't have a lot of the answers, but we can talk about them, and then we can make some noise, and that's what brings awareness to this.
Just to add on the ski point, when we first started last year, we were told by some of the water organizations that like you can't get the ski industry to care until it's actually affecting them. They don't really see how it connects to the snow, but I think like Krista said, since the New York Times article, that's really been changing in the last like couple of months.
I mean, I totally agree with you. We need to do something. But I guess I'm kind of new to Utah, 8 years, but like, what do we do? Like, we're all here because we're concerned. But what's the next step? Like, we're concerned, but concern is kind of irrelevant unless there's like a process of change.
Yeah, I
think. Oh, you want to say it?
I mean, I think that the thing is like unfortunately, we have to work in a system that like we have to say, okay, the system's not going to change, so we have to work to change it. We actually are bringing, we have a pretty cool idea. We hope all of you guys will come. We'll be hosting an event here the first week of October 7th and 8th, called Rights of Nature, because we actually think that there's some pretty big, giant changes that have to happen, and it's things that probably people haven't thought about. Like, what about if we gave some rights to the Great Salt Lake and started treating it as an entity? What would that be? So we're actually going to be having discussions like that, because we believe that like these small changes that have been happening for the last, I don't know, 30 years, right? Like there's been lots of people who have been focused on this, right? I'm like, oh, okay, we got to, save the Great Salt Lake, but it takes drastic changes. It's not the same things that we've been doing for the last 30 years. It's not the same things we've been doing for the last 5 years, right? Not even the last year. Like it takes drastic change. So that's why we're all here. We don't have the answers, but we believe that like being together and talking about it and making some noise, that's what's going to help us get there. So the actions that we're taking are, we've got rallies going on, as Chandler said at the very beginning. How can we help change legislation? We make noise, right? What makes people change is constituents saying we have to change. And that's what we're going to do.
We are working towards like very specific policy proposals for 2023. We just haven't solidified anything yet, but two major things. We have the cheapest water in the country, and so we have the highest municipal water rate in the country because there's no incentive to conserve. So fixing that is like number one. We are also the only state that pays property taxes to the water districts, who are proposing things like the Bay River Development Project, which is going to lower the lake by another 2 feet. So kind of fixing the corruption in Utah water. I don't know if y'all saw the ProPublica articles, but there were 2, and they go really in depth into just how corrupt our water system in Utah is. So I think pointing to that corruption, calling it out, and kind of making everybody aware and just having a stronger collective voice is where we start.
So something very recent and is going to be coming up, like a very concrete thing that you can be doing, that sneak preview. We're going to make a lot of noise about it. A bunch of environmental nonprofits are keeping a close eye on U.S. Magnesium right now. U.S. Magnesium, if you're not familiar with them, they are the biggest domestic producer of magnesium in the entire United States. The next biggest producer is in China. There's a couple other small sources across the U.S., but basically where we get our magnesium domestically comes from U.S. Magnesium. And magnesium is the only extractive industry along the lake that takes water out of the lake. Things like lithium, brine shrimp, they all want water in the lake. They need water in the lake. But with magnesium, they take water out to process the magnesium, and they are applying for a permit right now. There's a fantastic article in the Trib by Leah Larson right now. It explains it all out, but there's a permit that they are applying for, and the political realities of it look like the feds are just going to rubber stamp it because it is our biggest producer of magnesium, and that's all they're really thinking about. So we all need to come to these public hearings. We all need to be giving public comment and be making a lot of noise that there is no way U.S. Magnesium can just be pulling water out of the lake without putting water back in. Again, this is a very new thing. We're kind of developing our messaging around it, our strategy. You'll be hearing about it in the next couple of weeks. But keep an eye out on orgs like Save Our Great Salt Lake, like HEAL, like Sierra Club, like Friends of the Great Salt Lake, and see what they're saying about this permit process. Read that article by Leah Larson, and you'll be hearing about it if you follow us on Instagram or anything like that. And we'll be giving you opportunities to show up and make your voice heard. We'll be giving you opportunities to submit public comment in person or over email or in public comment form. So that's something that's immediately coming up, but that's just the first step in a long fight. We're going to be doing this a whole bunch. We'll be up at the state legislature. We'll be up. They're going to be trying to fund Bear River development, which we talked about, and it's a terrible idea. We all need to go there. You know, that's how this whole political process should work. It's corny, but it's what we got to do. But yeah, keep an eye out for that permitting process. US Magnesium, bad folks for like.
Yeah.
I've got just a question about kind of this quote right here. It says, the existential problem of infinite growth and constrained resources. How do we change the mind of power when we know that the entire Utah legislature are landlords, real estate developers, and the person in charge, Spencer Cox, is an alfalfa farmer? How do we change the minds of those people in power who don't seem to have a whole lot of incentive right now to change?
I think we got all need to just like, that's kind of what we're trying to do is like, okay, what is our message to, you know, point out what they're doing and saying wrong, and then we need hundreds of people behind us. And I think it's endless pressure, endlessly applied is what Zach from the Rivers Council always says. But we truly need people involved at a scale that we've never seen before.
I'll say something really briefly that I have been starting to think of this issue as, is that I think this is a really big first test of climate resiliency. And I think this may break that system in that